one of our time's most important investigative activists, which expose the completely crazed reality our politicians spins us into, is Andrew Feinstein. Andrew has a past in the South African parliament, but chose to leave the ruling party, ANC, when they did not want to investigate his suspicion of corruption during a national arms deal. In 2010, he published the book The Shadow World, An Insight to the Global Arms Trade, which through 700 pages and 3,000 footnotes exposes how senior politicians, arms dealers and manufacturers are orchestrating endless war, a shadow economy based on bloodshedding and destruction of our planet. Parts of the book have now been made into 1.5-hour documentary film. We met Andrew for half an hour and talked about the Danish government's purchase of F35 fighter jet planes, the political and media agenda of creating fear in the populations, how important it is for us citizens to take back the reality created by the propaganda, the post-factual society where lies don't have any consequences and scammers become presidents, the witch hunt on journalists and whistleblowers, and the completely absurd alliance between Saudi Arabia and the Western leaders.
The absurdity of the war on terror is reflected through Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is provided with more weaponry from the United States, the United Kingdom, most of Western Europe, than any other country besides Israel. But the reality is that Saudi Arabia, first of all, commits war crimes all the time, undertakes massive human rights abuses on its own population, where women are not allowed to vote, are not allowed to drive cars. The Saudi state beheads, cuts off the heads of more people every year than Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and all of those groups combined, but it's fine because they're our ally. But more important than that, Saudi Arabia funds those very groups who the US and NATO and Western Europe are fighting the war on terror against. So Al-Qaeda and ISIS receive support in the form of political support, weapons, money from Saudi Arabia. But a lot of those weapons are coming from America, from NATO countries. It's a complete absurdity. And it leads to the situation where currently in the Middle East, in Syria, Saudi Arabia and the Western countries are fighting with a group called Al-Nusra. But in Yemen, a Saudi-led bombing campaign is trying to bomb Al-Nusra. So the absurdity of the situation can only be understood by virtue of the fact that by doing all of this, we are keeping billions and billions of dollars going round and round the world.
In an evil spiral.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And many people benefit from that.
Yes, yes.
So on one arms deal that I investigated many years ago, the same arms deal that Mark Thatcher got £12 million on, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, who was the son of the then Saudi defense minister and Saudi's ambassador to America at the time, received a bribe of over £1 billion. And in case that wasn't enough, he also received as a gift from BAE Systems, a British company, a jet fighter, an Airbus jet, a plane, for his own use,
yes.
painted in the colors of his favorite American football team, the Dallas Cowboys.
Which you can see in the movie. Yeah?
That reflects the madness.
Sometimes you scratch your head in absurdity. I think sometimes when you fuck man. Our government have just finally made the final decision about buying 30 F35 fighter jets.
Yeah.
And you, I can understand, were inside our government and talking with some of the politicians, or what?
I spent just a couple of hours at the parliament here.
Yeah.
I can't even remember the names of the people we met with. We met with a few people.
Yeah.
And I was explaining to them two things.
Yeah.
The first, I spoke a little bit about the F35.
Okay.
And the second thing I spoke about was about how I understand sustainable development.
Uh-huh.
And how the notions of defense and security that they talk about are not actually sustainable. So there were really two avenues I was talking about. On the F-35, we have a guy in the film, Pierce Spray is his name, who worked in the Pentagon in America. And he designed jet fighters. And the jet fighter that he was most involved in was something called the F-16, which I don't really know, but people tell me it's a very good jet fighter.
It's one of the best jet fighters we had in
So he has a very good reputation. And since he left the Pentagon, it's very interesting what he does. He developed a new way of recording, particularly jazz. And he records jazz musicians, some of the best in the world, using his new technique. But he describes the F-35, and these aren't his exact words, but close. He says something like, it's the biggest piece of crap built by a company that specializes in crap. And this plane has failed its first 14 test flights. And Spray says, and this is a good thing, he says, the only people who are really in danger from this plane are the test pilots. Because it's so bad. But it reflects the nature of the arms trade, because what the companies have tried to do, together with the support of the military, is they've built this jet and they've tried to throw every bit of technology they can onto it. More and more advanced technology. But the reality is that the plane is completely irrelevant to any sort of conflict that the US is currently engaged in or might be engaged in for generations to come. But it's going to cost the American taxpayer $1.5 trillion. So I was telling people in Parliament that this plane makes no sense for Denmark. First of all, I think that people in this country, because it's important to remember that where people pay taxes, they land up paying for these things. So they're paying for the jet.
Exactly.
And even those people who don't earn enough money to pay much in tax, it's money that could be used for something else, for health, for education, for benefits. And so that was the first thing we said, that this, you know, I would like to see, and I think the people of Denmark should be able to see what sort of assessment you did of the dangers facing Denmark that led you to the answer that is the F-35. Because I don't know what the question is, if that's the right answer.
Yes, and that's what...
So that's the first thing. The second thing is the whole discourse that leads to a decision like the F-35 is a discourse of threats. So while I've been here, people have said to me, well, you know, we're close to Russia, and you don't know what's going to happen from Russia. And I say to them at the moment, first of all, you know, the Russian military is not what it was during the Cold War. Even the sort of the amount and the type of weapons they produce has fallen a lot, because most of the Soviet era weapons were produced not in what is now Russia, but what is now Ukraine. And I say, in addition to which, there is somebody who's now going to enter the White House whose best political friend seems to be the president of Russia. So I don't understand why you see these sorts of threats. And I think that in parallel with the arms trade, there is an industry that we describe as the fear industry, which is the creation of fear, so that our lives, especially in countries where we live comfortably, like Denmark. You know, I'm not talking about South Africa, where a lot of people don't live comfortably, where it's a struggle every day to survive. But in these countries, it's extraordinary the amount of time in the media, be it in newspapers, on television, in the radio, is spent telling us about things of which we should be fearful.
Exactly.
And whenever there's not an enemy, this entity, what someone in the film describes as the military-industrial entertainment complex, including Hollywood and most news services around the world, creates threats, whether they're real or not. And we sometimes forget, for instance, that currently we're living through one of the most peaceful periods in history. But in spite of that, we spend $1.75 trillion a year on weaponry and defense. That's $250 for every person on the planet. So if you put that together with the fact that actually we live in quite a peaceful era, there's something wrong. And what I believe from my 16 years of work in this area now is that there are so many people in positions of power at the top of the political world or at the top of the corporate world, and the two are very closely intermeshed, who benefit so much politically and economically from war, that we have to create these fears, that when the fear doesn't exist, when the threat doesn't exist, we create the threat. So we have a war on terror.
Yes.
Now, I don't know what that is.
No, imaginary war.
You know, my former boss, Nelson Mandela, was described by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher as a terrorist. And they said they would never negotiate with a communist terrorist like that. Now, I worked for that man for many years. And if that's what a terrorist is, then that's what I want to be. So the terrorist is in the eye of the beholder.
Yes.
And unfortunately gets used to ensure that we continue to spend absurd amounts of money on weaponry and defense. And a lot of that money gets paid back to us in bribes. The trade in weapons accounts for 40% of all corruption in world trade, and a lot of that money goes to political parties. And then people will be sitting here in Denmark and thinking, but oh, that wouldn't be us. That would be other countries that are corrupt. But let me tell you, when I started this work and I looked from Thatcher onwards, I discovered Margaret Thatcher's son, on the biggest arms deal in the world, was paid £12 million. That Helmut Kohl, the former Chancellor of Germany, funded his party, the Christian Democratic Union, for 17 years, to a large extent on the proceeds of arms deals. And I'm thinking to myself, this industry reflects the very worst of how business and politics, how money and politics come together and create the mess that is the world we live in today.
Yes. And us as citizens, more and more are also aware that there is this information war or fearful war of we have to be scared of this, therefore we have to have more surveillance, or we have to buy fighter attack jets to go bomb in Libya, in Iraq, in Syria.
Absolutely.
To have it safe up here.
Yeah, it does nothing of the sort. First of all, in terms of a country's own citizens, there have to be the dangers, as you say, because it's then an excuse to conduct more surveillance of us. But let me give you just one example. Edward Snowden has said that the country that has more surveillance than any other in the world today is the United Kingdom, where I live in London. And about 18 months ago, The Guardian wrote a report that said that there is this huge intelligence network that is headquartered in a place called GCHQ, where all the surveillance takes place from. And they were told from somebody there that one of the groups of people whose communications are intercepted by GCHQ all the time is any investigative journalists who work on anything to do with defense. So now are they saying that I am a threat to national security because I expose the fact that on one arms deal, a British company, with the support of the British government, paid £6 billion in bribes? Now I'm a threat to national security? I would argue that the payment of £6 billion of bribes is what is really threatening our sustainable well-being.
Exactly.
So that's on the one side. On the other side, you look at the involvement in Denmark, in bombings in Libya, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. And let me take just one example, the example of Libya. So the Danish government, NATO, would argue that by bombing Libya when we did, we were making the world safer for ourselves. Well, what they forget to tell you is that all of our governments, the NATO countries, sold so many weapons to Muammar Gaddafi, many of which he didn't even have the people to use, so they were just put away in warehouses. But when we decided to start bombing Libya, the first thing we had to do is bomb some of the installations of weapons that we had sold to him. So it reminds me when the United States decided to invade Iraq. First of all, they destroy all of the oil wells in the bombing. Then they pay the defense companies a whole lot of money for the bombing. And then they pay those same companies to repair the oil wells. So we're doing the same thing in Libya. Today, Iraq and Libya are places where many people opposed to the West, as we call it, are coming up because of the invasions by the West of those countries. So we're spending huge amounts of our own money. We're making the countries we're bombing less stable, but we're also making the world more dangerous for ourselves, because in the case of Libya, after Gaddafi fell, a whole lot of those weapons landed up on the black markets of the world. So you could go onto the internet and you could buy a surface-to-air missile that you can put on your shoulder and you can shoot down a passenger jet. And that's a consequence of our selling weapons to Gaddafi and then bombing Gaddafi. So the madness of the national security discourse actually makes our world more dangerous than it is.
And when you talk to our elected parliamentarians about this, of course, I can imagine some of them, they understand that this is the consequences of the politics that we have engaged for the last 10, 12 years with the United States in front of us. But do they say, yes, you are right, Andrew, or what is the...
I have never experienced a politician except the current leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, who chaired the anti-war movement in the United Kingdom for the last 30 years before he became leader. No other politician in the world has said to me, I'm right. They're all very polite. They nod their heads, but none of them will actually say, oh, I agree with you.
Or they can see the consensus, or they can see the pattern of this.
But you know what? Sometimes they will say to me, well, where do you get this information? So I put in front of them the book I wrote.
700 pages.
700 pages. But it's not just 700 pages, it's also almost 3,000 footnotes. So if I say that something happened, like Margaret Thatcher's son received £12 million in a bribe, I don't just say it because I think it's a nice thing to write about. I say it because I have the evidence, and then I put in the footnotes where the evidence is, and I give a link to where they can find the documents, either on my website or some other website. So I put the book in front of them and I say to them, here are the facts that I've just told you about. You go and read the book. And then you think about whether your defense policy, your military spending, actually makes sense for Denmark. So I don't expect them in the meeting that I have with them to suddenly say, now I see the light. I want to start a process of thinking with them, where maybe some of them who are more honest with themselves will actually see that there are very real interests behind the stories that we tell ourselves about defense, safety, and development today.
And how, because I can also feel an awakening between normal citizens, ordinary citizens. We are more and more away from the government, because we can see that the things they tell us, it's actually propaganda, or what you can call it, straight out lies.
Look, I was a politician for 8 years.
Yes, but when are they gonna? What is there going to be? Because it cannot always continue on this path that we're going.
It can't. We now live in what some people call a post-fact political world, or a post-truth political world, where politicians can say whatever they want to say. A man can get elected president of America by standing in front of millions of people, both in person and on television, and lying. And lying as often as he wants to, and we all know it's lies, because sometimes he will say something that we all know just from our own experience is a lie, and when you tell him it's a lie, it doesn't matter to him. The consequence of that is the election we've just had in America, where we had a choice between a racist, homophobic, misogynist, or a woman who embodies the establishment and who has made so much money only because she and her husband are politicians that Goldman Sachs will pay them $500,000 to talk for half an hour about whatever they want to talk about. And I think you're quite right. What underpins that is that those who govern and those who are governed, the people in these countries, are getting further and further and further apart. And those who are governed forget two things. They forget that they're only in those positions because they're supposed to be representing us. And we are the people who pay their salaries. And we pay for their very nice lifestyle. But that link is broken.
Yes.
They do what is in their interests, their personal and their political interests. And the first place in which we have to set that right is by us as citizens not being so passive. As by us as citizens saying, I can see how the system works for those right at the top. The richer pay less and less taxes. The politicians become more and more arrogant, less and less connected to the real world. But we, the vast majority of people, are the ones whose lives are getting worse. We're not earning as much money as we were. Benefits are being cut. The way in which the state operates isn't nearly as good as it used to be. We have to reclaim politics for ourselves. And we have to go back to an understanding of what democracy is, which is government for the people, by the people. And because at the moment that's broken.
Yes. And we see we don't hear so much about it in the media. And just to quickly touch of that, because we see it actually also up in Iceland.
Yeah.
There we see the citizens are taking back the government.
Yeah. No, we do. We've seen in various ways in Iceland, we've seen, you know, first of all, Iceland is one of the only countries that after the financial crisis that started in late 2007, 2008, which was created by the big banks around the world, Iceland is the only country on the planet that jailed some of those bankers and kicked out all of its politicians. And then some of the politicians who came into office after that, like the mayor of Reykjavik, who was a performance artist with many tattoos all over his body, he ensured that in Reykjavik, every citizen of a voting age had access to a tablet so that they could participate in any decision that the local government was making. You could have discussions on your tablet and you could vote on your tablet, which is a form of direct democracy, where you're doing away with the intermediaries who tell you what to do and often lie to you. So I think there's something in that experiment that we have to learn from. There is something about the notion of political parties that we need to think about again. You know, I remember a time, even in the United Kingdom, when political parties, they would have a conference and their members would decide what their policies were. For the last few decades, those conferences, they've been advertisements, they've been PR exercises. And what Jeremy Corbyn is trying to do in the Labour Party in Britain, for instance, which is also an interesting experiment, is to give the power back to the members So hundreds of thousands of people are now joining the Labour Party.
Yes, yes.
It has 650,000 members, making it the largest political party by membership in Europe. And we still have to see whether that experiment will work, but at least it's trying to do something different.
Exactly. So we see different light spots at the end of the tunnel. I know don't have so much time, so one more question, because you also touched that when you talked about being a journalist and perhaps a threat to the governments.
Yeah.
Also like whistleblowers, they are like whistleblowers.
Yeah.
What is, can you talk something about you as a journalist digging deep inside this? What are you experiencing personally?
I don't regard myself as a journalist.
No, but
I regard myself primarily as an activist.
Activist. Good.
So I happen to use for my activism, I happen to do investigations and research.
Yes.
And I produce those in as many different ways as I can, so as many different types of people can have access to that material. Because the most important thing we as ordinary people can do to hold to account those in power, be it corporate power or political power, is information, is to put things in the public domain that they don't want to be in the public domain. And what that means as a consequence is that, for instance, we assume that our communications are intercepted. So we have to use encryption. We sometimes face threats. So I've had letters from arms dealers where they say, if you write about me again or you talk about me again, you won't live to regret it. But the other threat that we face is a legal threat. So powerful, wealthy people who we write about try and sue us all the time. And in Britain, where I'm based and where my little organization is, you have to be able to show that you have £500,000 before you can defend yourself in court if someone tries to sue you. So justice is only justice for the wealthy. Because for me, I don't earn much money. My organization doesn't have much money. We don't have £500,000 to defend ourselves. But what we do have is the fact that we will not put anything into the public domain that isn't fact and isn't true. So they can try as much as they like, and we just send them all of the documents, including their clients' bank statements, about why we've said what we've said about their clients. But it creates a very hard pressure on you, because you worry about it, and you've got to spend time getting rid of it. But it's important to say that the people who really make our work possible are the whistleblowers from inside the military, from inside the companies, from inside government. And those people are under threat in a way they've never been before. So it's people like Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, who are incredibly brave to reveal information, and it costs them, in Chelsea's case, it costs her her freedom. In Edward Snowden's case, he has to live in Russia outside his own country. But there are many, many, many people, not as high profile as that, who provide information to people like me. And those are the real heroes and heroines. And those are the people that government focuses on even more. Because if we look, the Obama administration in the United States of America, which we should remember, accounts for about 40% of all weapons and defense spending in the entire world. Just one country, the United States of America. Barack Obama's administration has prosecuted more whistleblowers, particularly in national security, than all other American presidents throughout American history. So those are the conditions that we face, and those are the conditions that we have to fight against.
And that's because the governments, they obviously, which you also see in the film, in the documentary, and we can read in the book, that they have a lot of things that they won't have out in the public.
No, what they do is, so the area that I work in,
yes,
of the arms trade, the reason I work in it is because everything that happens in this business happens in secret.
Yes.
So if we ask through a freedom of information request for some information about a weapons deal, we're always told, no, it's a matter of national security, so we can't give you the information. But they use national security to hide criminal conduct, to hide things that advantage their political party or their personal position in politics, or to hide bribes that they themselves are involved in.
Do you think that some of our politicians, since they have chosen the F35 from Lockheed Martin, the crab factory, have been bribed because a lot of they started 5 different fighter jets in this offer? Yeah. And now Boeing is actually suing. They want to sue the state because they choose Lockheed Martin. Yeah. But where can I go to see? So let me investigate something.
The only way I can answer that at the moment, because the problem, because all of this is secret.
Yeah.
It's very difficult for us to investigate as a deal is happening. We usually have to wait till the deal's been done. Mm-hmm. And until we can identify a possible whistleblower, or try and get hold of some of the information, or try and say to a prosecutor, you've got to look at that. Mm-hmm. Before then, what I can say to you is I've been doing this work for 16 years, since I tried to investigate a deal in the South African Parliament as an MP, and my own party stopped me and kicked me out. I haven't investigated every arms deal that's happened in the last 16 years, but I've investigated a lot of them. I haven't found one, not one, anywhere in the world that doesn't have some form of bribe being paid. Because bribes aren't paid in the defense business because there's some bad person involved, there's some rotten apple, as they call it, involved. It is built into the structure and the economics of the trade. So the deals don't happen without bribes. So the only time I will tell you that nobody in Denmark has taken a bribe on the F35 deal is if the Danish and American governments, Lockheed Martin and the Danish military say to my organization or somebody like us, here we are. Here are all the papers of the deal. You can look at anything you want to, as long as you keep it confidential. And then at the end of your investigation, you can tell the people of Denmark whether there's been any corruption or not. If they allow me to do that, then I'll be able to tell you yes or no, whether there is corruption or bribery or not. But the other thing that we are doing with the film just this week in Copenhagen is we are wanting to put together a coalition of organizations committed to peace, to start first of all protesting the F-35 decision in this country, asking questions about it and demanding answers on behalf of the Danish people. And I would hope that I will continue to work with this coalition of groups to once, if the deal is done, to actually interrogate very closely the details of that deal. And then one day, hopefully I'll be able to answer you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Not
we
at
look
all.
forward
Great to
to this. You too.
Thanks.